Hello everyone, I hope you are doing well today. My name is Cheryl. Today I would love to share my personal journey into the question the narrative topic. I would like for us to ponder the possibility that our history is merely created and written by the founders of the land. Today's topic will cover the lost generation. Let's explore the narrative together. The lost generation was the social generational cohort that was in early adulthood during the World War I. Lost in this context refers to the disoriented, wandering, directionlessness spirit of many of the war's survivors in the early post-war period. The term is also particularly used to refer to a group of American writers living in Paris during the 1920s. Gertrude Stein is accredited with coining the term, and it was subsequently popularized by Ernest Hemingway, who used it in the epigraph for his 1926 novel, The Sun Also Rises. You are all a lost generation. In a more general sense, the lost generation is considered to be made up of individuals born between 1883 and 1900. In the wake of the Industrial Revolution, Western members of the lost generation grew up in societies which were more literate, consumerist, and media-saturated than ever before, but which also tended to maintain strict conservative social values. Young men of the cohort were mobilized on a mass scale for the First World War, a conflict which was often seen as the defining moment of their age group's lifespan. Young women also contributed to and were affected by the war, and in its aftermath gained greater freedoms politically and in other areas of life. The lost generation also heavily vulnerable to the Spanish flu pandemic and became the driving force behind many cultural changes, particularly in major cities during what became known as the Roaring Twenties. Later, they experienced the economic effects of the Great Depression and often saw their own sons leave for the battlefields of the Second World War. In the developed world, they tended to reach retirement and average life expectancy during the decades after the conflict, but some significantly outlived the norm. The last surviving person who was known to have been born during the 19th century died in 2018. Her name was Nabi Tajima. In Europe, they are mostly known as the generation of 1914, for the year World War I began. In France, they were sometimes called the gunfire generation. In Great Britain, the term was originally used for those who died in the war and often implicitly referred to upper-class casualties who were perceived to have died disproportionately, robbing the country of a future elite. Many felt that the flower of youth had the best manhood of peoples had been mowed down. For example, such notable casualties as Isaac Rosenberg, Rupert Brooke, Edward Thomas, Wilfred Owen, composer George Butterworth, and physicist Henry Moseley. When the lost generation were growing up, the ideal family arrangement was generally seen as the man of the house being the breadwinner and primary authority figure, whilst his wife dedicated herself to caring for the home and children. Most even less well-off married couples attempted to conform to this ideal. It was common for family members of 3 generations to share a home. Wealthier households also tended to include domestic servants, though their numbers would have varied from single maid to a large group depending on how rich the family was. Public concern for the welfare of children was intensifying by the later 19th century, with laws being passed and societies formed to prevent their abuse. The state increasingly gained the legal right to intervene in private homes and family life to protect minors from harm. However, beating children for misbehavior was not only common, but viewed as the duty of the responsible caregiver. Sewer systems designed to remove human waste from urban areas had become widespread in industrial cities by the late 19th century, helping to reduce the spread of diseases such as cholera. Legal standards for the quality of drinking water also began to be introduced. However, the introduction of electricity was slower, and during the formative years of the lost generation, gas lights and candles were still the most common form of lighting. Though statistics on child mortality dating back to the beginning of the lost generation's lifespan are limited, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention reports that in 1900, 1 in 10 American infants died before their first birthday. Figures for the United Kingdom states that during the final years of the 19th century, mortality in the first 5 years of childhood was plateauing at a little under 1 in every 4 births. At around 1 in 3 in 1800, the early childhood mortality rate had declined overall throughout the next 100 years, but would fall most sharply during the first half of the 20th century, reaching less than 1 in 20 by 1950. This meant that members of the lost generation were somewhat less likely to die at a very early age than their parents and grandparents. Laws restricting child labor in factories had begun to appear from around 1840 onwards, and by the end of the 19th century, compulsory education had been introduced throughout much of the Western world for at least a few years of childhood. By 1900, levels of illiteracy had fallen to less than 11% in the United States, around 3% in Great Britain, and only 1% in Germany. However, the problems of illiteracy and lack of school provision or attendance were felt more acutely in parts of Eastern and Southern Europe. Schools of this time period tended to emphasize strict discipline, expecting pupils to memorize information by rote. To help deal with teacher shortages, older students were often used to help supervise and educate their younger peers. Dividing children into classes based on age became more common as schools grew. While elementary schooling was becoming increasingly accessible for Western children at the turn of the century, secondary education was still much more of a luxury. Only 11% of American 14 to 17-year-olds were enrolled at high school in 1900, a figure which had only marginally increased by 1910. Though the school-leaving age was officially meant to be 14 by 1900 until the First World War, most British children could leave school through rules put in place by local authorities at 12 or 13 years old. It was not uncommon at the end of the 19th century for Canadian children to leave school at 9 or 10 years old. By the 1890s, children's toys entered into mass production. In 1893, the British toy company William Britton revolutionized the production of toy soldiers by devising the method of hollow casting, making soldiers that were cheaper and lighter than their competitors. This led to metal toy soldiers, which had previously been the preserve for boys from wealthier families, gaining mass appeal during the late Victorian and Edwardian period. Dolls often sold by street vendors at a low price were popular with the girls. Teddy bears appeared for the first time in the early 1900s. Tin-plated penny toys were also sold by street sellers for a single penny. The turn of the 20th century saw a surge in public park buildings in part of the West to provide public space in rapidly growing industrial towns. They provided a means for children from different backgrounds to play and interact together, sometimes in specially designed facilities. They held frequent concerts and performances. Beginning around the middle of the 19th century, magazines of various types, which had previously mainly targeted the few that could afford them, found rising popularity among the general public. The latter part of the century not only saw rising popularity for magazines targeted specifically at young boys, but the development of a relatively new genre aimed at girls. A significant milestone was reached in the development of cinema when, in 1895, projected movie images were first shown to a paying audience in Paris. Early films were very short, generally taking the form of newsreels, comedic sketches, and short documentaries. They lacked sound but were accompanied by music, lectures, and a lot of audience participation. A notable film industry had developed by the start of the First World War. The Lost Generation is best known for being the cohort which primarily fought in World War I. More than 70 million people were mobilized during the First World War, around 8.5 million of whom were killed and 21 million wounded in the conflict. About 2 million soldiers were believed to have been killed by disease, while individual battles sometimes caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. Beyond the extent of the deaths, the war had a profound effect on many of its survivors, giving many young men severe mental health problems and crippling physical disabilities. The war also unsettled many soldiers' sense of reality who had gone into the conflict with the belief that battle and hardship was a path to redemption and greatness, when years of pain, suffering, and loss seemed to bring about little in the way of a better future. Many were left with a profound sense of disillusionment. Though soldiers on the front lines of the First World War were almost exclusively men, women contributed to the war effort in other ways. Many took the jobs men had left in previously male-dominated sectors such as heavy industry, while some even took on non-combat military roles. Many, particularly wealthier women, took part in voluntary work to contribute to the war effort or help those suffering due to it, such as the wounded or refugees, often experiencing manual labor for the first time. However, this reshaping of the female role led to fears that the sexes having the same responsibilities would disrupt the fabric of society and that more competition for work would leave men unemployed and erode their pay. Most women had to exit the employment they had taken during the war as soon as it concluded. Women gaining of political rights sped up in the Western world after the First World War, while employment opportunities for unmarried women widened. This time period saw the development of a new type of young woman in popular culture known as a flapper, who were known for their rebellion against previous social norms. They had a physical distinctive appearance compared to their predecessors only a few years earlier, cutting their hair into bobs, wearing shorter dresses and more makeup, while taking on a new code of behavior filled with more recklessness, party-going, and overt sexuality. The aftermath of the First World War saw great changes in the political situation, including a trend toward republicanism, the founding of many new relatively small nation-states which had previously been part of a larger empires, and greater suffrage for groups such as the working class and women. The immediate post-war I period was characterized by continued political violence and economic instability. The late 1910s saw the Spanish flu pandemic, which was unusual in the sense that it killed many younger adults of the same lost generation age that had mainly died in the war. Later, especially in major cities, much of the 1920s is considered to have been a more prosperous period when the lost generation, in particular, escaped the suffering and turmoil they had lived through by rebelling against the social and cultural norms of their elders. 1929 saw the beginning of the Great Depression, which would continue throughout the 1930s and become the longest and most severe financial downturn ever experienced in Western industrialized history. Though it had begun in the United States, the crisis led to sharp increases in worldwide unemployment, reduction in economic output, and deflation. The Depression was also a major catalyst for the rise of Nazism in Germany and the beginning of its quest to establish dominance over the European continent, which would eventually lead to the World War II in Europe. The 1930s saw rising popularity for radio, with the vast majority of Western households having access to the medium by the end of the decade. Programming included soap operas, music, and sports. Educational broadcasts were frequently available. The airwaves also proved a source of news, and particularly for the era's autocratic regimes, an outlet for political propaganda. When World War II broke out in 1939, the lost generation faced a major global conflict for the second time in their lifetime, and now often had to watch their sons go to the battlefield. The place of the older generation who had been young adults during World War I in the new conflict was a theme in popular media of the time period, with examples including Waterloo Bridge and Old Bill and Son. Like in the First World War, women helped to make up for labor shortages caused by mass military recruitment by entering more traditionally masculine employment and entering the conflict more directly in female military branches and underground resistant movements. However, those in middle age were generally less likely to become involved in this kind of work than the young. This was particularly true of any kind of military involvement. In the West, the lost generation tended to reach the end of their working lives in around the 1950s and 60s. For those members of the cohort who had fought in World War I, their military service was frequently viewed as a defining moment in their lives, even many years later. Retirement notices of this era often included information on a man's services in the First World War. In his memoir, A Movable Feast, published after Hemingway's and Stein's death, Ernest Hemingway writes that Gertrude Stein heard the phrase from a French garage owner who serviced Stein's car. When a young mechanic failed to repair the car quickly enough, the garage owner shouted at the young man, "You are all a generation perdue." While telling Hemingway the story, Stein added, "That is what you are. That's what you all are. All of you young people who served in the war. You are a lost generation." Hemingway thus credits the phrase to Stein, who was then his mentor and patron.